sharing today's moderating responsibilities with my Stimson colleague, Vard Chalkin. Vard is a non-resident fellow at Stimson, where she focuses on U.S.-Russia relations, conflict resolution in the South Caucasus region. Navar has been instrumental in helping us conceptualize and organize today's program. She, along with two of today's panelists, will be joining us from Armenia. I want to turn to introducing our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Professors Carrie Kavanaugh, Alyssa von Yoden-Forgy, Siranush Sahakian, and Armin Toyan. Carrie is a former U.S. ambassador and peace mediator who is currently a professor of diplomacy at the University of Kentucky and chairman of International Alert, London-based independent peacebuilding organization. Carrie had a 22-year foreign service career focused on conflict resolution, including firsthand experience with Nagorno-Karabakh, arms control, and humanitarian issues. This included diplomatic postings in Berlin, Moscow, Tbilisi, Rome, and Bern, as well as Washington assignments in the State Department, the Pentagon, and on Capitol Hill. Upon leaving government service, he took a full-time professorship at the University of Kentucky and became director of its Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. He remains active in conflict resolution and peace building, with several leading British and European non-governmental organizations on civil society initiatives and Track 2 diplomatic efforts. Alyssa occupies an endowed chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College, where she's been developing a graduate certificate and MA program in genocide prevention and human security. Before coming to Keene State, she was the Dr. Marcia Radikoff-Grossman Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University in my beloved New Jersey, where she developed the first graduate level credit-bearing genocide prevention certificate program in the world, and a visiting scholar in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She earned her BA in African Studies and History in New York, and her MA and PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania. Her work has received fellowship from the Social Science Research Council, the Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. She teaches undergraduate and graduate classes on the Holocaust, comparative genocide, gender, sexual violence, war rights, imperialism, and genocide prevention. Since 2015, she has taught an annual workshop on gender and genocide at the Zorion Institute's Genocide and Human Rights University program at the University of Toronto. Siranush is a highly regarded professional with over 15 years of experience in human rights, judicial reform, and corruption prevention. She has served as an aide to the president of Armenia at Armenia's Ministry of Justice and as an ad hoc judge of the European Court of Human Rights. She is founder and president of the NGO Protection of Rights Without Borders and has served as expert for a range of international organizations such as the OSCE, UNICEF Armenia, UNDP, and the Center for European Law and Integration, as well as others. She was also a lecturer at the American University of Armenia. And last but not least, Arman is a former human rights defender or ombudsman for the Republic of Armenia and the head of Armenia's National Preventive Mechanism under the UN OPCAT. He is an ad hoc judge in the European Court of Human Rights. He has served as Armenia's Deputy Minister of Justice and also has been Armenia's deputy representative before the European Court of Human Rights. Arman is also a permanent international advisor in the Council of Europe. He has served as advisor to the president of Armenia's Constitutional Court. And finally, like Siranush, he is also a lecturer at the American University of Armenia. Welcome to all of you, and thank you again for joining us today. I've got a couple of additional housekeeping comments. Ilhan Dahir, my colleague at the Stimson Center, will be running today's Zoom call. Ilhan will keep everyone but the person presenting muted. We will hold all questions until our presenters have finished their presentations. To facilitate discussion, I will ask those participants using the video Zoom link to signal me using the raise hand function when they would like to raise a question or comment. I will take questions and comments in the order that I see you. Please state your name after I call on you and which of our presenters you would like to address your question or comment to. For those of you just using the Zoom link audio, please use the chat feature to raise questions or comments. Ilhan will share the questions in the order that they are received. And finally, for those of you who are interested, we are making available Zoom's closed captioning capability. However, each of you will have to activate it individually using the icon at the bottom of your screen. And with that, before starting our panel, I'd like to turn the floor over briefly to Navar for a few introductory comments. Navar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. And thank you very much for joining this very timely discussion on the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. Before we get to the topic, I would like us to think of the following framework. We're today discussing a case related to the Armenian cause at large, not just the Nagorno-Karabakh case. And at the same time, we are discussing a case that's related to genocide and human rights violations prevention mechanisms in general. We all know that the first genocide of the 20th century was the Armenian genocide of 1915 by the Ottoman Empire. The very term genocide was actually coined in reference to these events. After that, unfortunately, many other genocides and ethnic cleansings happened in different parts of the world, and they still keep happening. When the US President Joe Biden recognized the Armenian genocide in 2021, he said, "We remember all those who died in the Armenian genocide, and we recommit ourselves to preventing such an atrocity from ever again occurring." What we are here today because we all care about the question how. So how to prevent such crimes against humanity in the world in general from ever again occurring. The Armenian case shows that the main direction, actually one of the main directions in which we need to look to answer this question is whether or not the genocide perpetrator states have been held accountable and have paid for the crime. We should remember that in this particular case, Turkey has neither recognized nor paid reparations to the Armenians. And more recently, in 2020 war, Turkey was instrumental in assisting Azerbaijan in the war against the unrecognized and at the same time democratic Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. So as a result of that war, Azerbaijan took control of 75% of the Nagorno-Karabakh territory, which deprived the Armenians of what they called a buffer zone, the large territory connecting them to Armenia, and left only a narrow strip of land that they call a lifeline because it connects like one road that connects the whole Karabakh to Armenia and thus to the rest of the world. So it is this very narrow strip of land that has been blocked by Azerbaijan, and the situation that currently is as a result of that. Let me also add that this corridor called Lachin Corridor was monitored and controlled by the Russian peacekeepers after the 2020 war till now. So I believe that the question for scholars to explore is to what extent what is happening with the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh today is actually the result, or to what extent it is connected to the Armenian genocide and to the fact that it was not recognized or paid for. So some might say, why bother? It happened about 100 years ago. But did it really end there? That's the question. If it did, we perhaps would not be having this discussion about Nagorno-Karabakh today. So I don't know if there is a chance to show any maps so that the audience knows better what the regional configuration is, or maybe it's better to pass to the speakers already, depending on how much time we have for that.
So why don't we jump into our panel?
Yeah.
And
Okay, so not to take too much time.
Okay.
All right.
Carrie, I'm going to give
Thank you.
the floor to you first. You're muted, Carrie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today about a serious concern that I think the international community is aware of, but may not yet have found a solution of how to address it. As Jim noted, one of my current positions is chairman of International Alert in London. It's probably Britain's largest peace building NGO, and it was formed in part to alert the international community to the instance of events like this that ran a risk of leading to genocide. It's a wonderful position I have, in that Desmond Tutu held it first, I think. And if you're following in his footsteps, that's a wonderful thing, and you know you're doing the right thing. And today we get to talk about very much the kind of situation the world needs to be alerted to. Jim had asked me to talk about the origins of the conflict and a bit about what the impact of the situation in Ukraine is on what's happening now. And I want to do both of those, but I also want to be very frank, upset to have a full discussion of the origins of the conflict. It's more time than we had for everybody. To talk fully about what's going on now, more time than we have from everybody. Since there's not an Azerbaijani representative here, I'm not going to even begin to try to lay out here's what they would say in response to others' positions. But I want to give you a sort of objective, big picture view of the situation and a sense of the challenges of dealing with this region of the world in international affairs. The Army Chief of Staff at one point was bringing 2- and 3-star generals to the War College to sort of get up on what might be important issues ahead. And he had me and a group of others come at one point to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh and the Caucasus. And I had been warned by Carlisle, where the Army War College is in Pennsylvania, the military needs slides. So I brought 20 slides. The slides were all satellite photography from far out of the Caucasus and really pretty pictures of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia on the ground. And it was interesting because the 2- and 3-star generals got it very quickly. The satellite photography shows this is a quarter of the planet, which is a crossroads, and has a deep history of people going back and forth on it for millennia. The close-up pictures show this is a part of the planet that is characterized by incredibly gorgeous scenery made up of staggeringly tall mountains and really deep valleys that divide people into pockets all over the countryside. So you have a region flooded east and west, north and south by passing through populations and collecting points for people, again, for millennia, in small pockets where they're broken apart. Why do I bring this up today? Because it leads to an unending challenge of whose land is this? Who was here first? Who rightfully should be able to do this or that in this place or that? And there aren't definitive answers to much of that. And the backdrop of some of what we'll talk about today, I want to talk about the practical concerns on the ground, is a discussion where you'll find an older map and an older map. And now I'm talking about maps that are of the era when California is depicted as an island, when the east coast of North America sort of fizzles out around Virginia. They will find maps and go, but look, this was Armenia. This was Azerbaijan. These names here, Albania, this is them, this is us. So there is an underlying discussion without much resolution. We want to talk about when the conflict started. Probably for our purposes, the important part isn't the deep history, but more recent history. And it's that they started fighting before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this conflict, Armenians fighting with Azerbaijanis, breaks out in the Gorbachev era. And there is an effort by the Soviet Union to stop it with military force, and that fails. So as an internal issue, the Soviet Union can't handle it. Soviet Union fails. And then as an external issue, you have an interstate conflict now, nominally between Azerbaijan and a breakaway region of Nagorno-Karabakh, but in fact with support from Armenian forces to have fighting in the 1990s. That fighting, as you heard, led to the every word I use will upset somebody, so it's hard to characterize, led to land that is recognized internationally as Azerbaijan being under Armenian control. Depending on who you talk to, 13% of the land, 20% of the land, the numbers jump all around. Number isn't particularly important, but what's important is there's this constant issue on land. Another important piece of why did that problem bubble up in the Soviet Union at all? Borders could not be drawn here effectively to put all ethnic groups in one area because they were scattered in those valleys. Also, in Moscow, under Stalin, there was a desire to draw borders in a manner that would make the safety and security of ethnic populations in part dependent on Moscow. So if you were an Armenian living in an exclave, so detached from Armenia, maybe you didn't trust Azerbaijan, but you could count on Moscow to make sure your rights were respected and protected. If you were an Azerbaijani living in Armenia, the same. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there goes that safety valve too, and it becomes a concern for ethnic populations comfortable living with one another. With the fighting, they take sides. Could they live with one another? Certainly. They had for millennia. They do today in Georgia still. The communities are not far apart from one another in the Republic of Georgia. They get along fine. Used to be a substantial Armenian population in the vicinity of Baku. Used to be a substantial Azerbaijan population in Armenia. So the ability to live together is there. The underlying cause of the problems isn't a religious strife problem. It's a who's living with people that are like ethnic nationals. And how do you resolve that without a clear path to resolution? The problem we see today is that issue, how to resolve the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Is it a part of Azerbaijan with special privileges or rights? Is it going to be a breakaway independent place? Is it going to join somehow with Armenia? Was never solved in decades of peace discussions back and forth between Armenia and Azerbaijan, with the help initially of the Russians. They got a ceasefire, they didn't get a peace deal. With the help initially of OSCE in its chairmanship, peace talks started early and led in part by Italians, then Swedes, then Finns, and then evolved into a formal structure. The Minsk Group was the name given it for the whole time, but a troika headed Minsk Group chairmanship of Russia, the United States, and France. They worked for decades trying to find a compromise that would be acceptable to Armenia and to Azerbaijan. Neither side had great interest, or great enough interest, I should say, in making compromises to appease the other to make a deal. Initially, Armenia held this Azerbaijan territory, and over time grew to like being able to hold that Azerbaijan territory. When the situation changed in 2020, with the fighting that broke out then, Azerbaijan regained most of that territory. And in fact, the fighting only stopped because there was a danger also of all of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh being either killed or removed from that region. Russia stopped it then, brokered a ceasefire. Ceasefire included an agreement to put in about 2,000 peacekeepers, Russian peacekeepers, and also to establish and protect 2 corridors, one connecting Nagorno-Karabakh, what's left of that region, not under Azerbaijan control, in Armenia, and another to connect Azerbaijan to its broken apart region of Nakhchivan. The Lachin corridor is what we're talking about today with the blockade. The other one is yet to be established. The blockade, I think, is viewed by most as an effort to encourage what little population remains in Karabakh to leave. It's sort of a soft version of ethnic cleansing. And formally, initially, the argument was these are environmental protesters. They were upset over the mining, illegal mining of gold in mines in the Karabakh region, and they believed the gold was being sold to purchase weapons, which were being shipped into Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia. And they blocked the road to be able to inspect vehicles to see if they have either gold coming out or weapons coming in. Under the provisions of the Russian brokered ceasefire, the Russian peacekeepers should not have allowed that to happen. They should be allowing traffic to flow freely in humanitarian assistance to go through that corridor to reach the people, the population that remains in that part of Karabakh, not under Azerbaijan's control. The Russian peacekeepers aren't doing that. They watch the World Cup with the protesters. The protesters on occasion bring them coffee, tea, and treats. On occasion, it's the Russian peacekeepers give the protesters coffee, tea, and treats. But the protesters, by one side, are seen as legitimate environmental protesters. By another side is not really protesters or representatives of civil society, but simply people there to blockade. The effect of that blockade started December 12th, continues, is significant. In Armenia, if you saw the piece in the New York Times, and again, not many people can get to Karabakh, but reports are coming out. All that's left in the stores are candy and alcohol. Medicine is in short supply. It's one thing the International Committee for the Red Cross is getting through the corridor. They are getting medicine up to the Karabakh region that Azerbaijan doesn't control. And it is also clear as of last week, President Aliyev said, oh, the blockade, any Karabakhsi that want to go to Armenia, if they feel they're not Azerbaijani citizens and they want to leave, they're free to leave. And I think that made it clear the soft side of that ethnic cleansing. They're not free to come back. There were high school kids on a field trip in Yerevan when this blockade started. They've not been allowed to go home to their parents. Parents are free to leave forever Karabakh to go join their kids. So it is a one-way corridor potentially, but I don't think people have been lining up to try and see even if that works. But we're at a stalemate. International communities intervened to the point of diplomacy. Pope Francis talked about it in December. All the major European leaders have been calling both sides, Armenia and Azerbaijan, to find a solution. Blinken talked to the Armenians, I think, Tuesday. He's expected to talk to Aliyev today or tomorrow. So there is a dialogue, there is an effort, but there's been no sign of movement. A Russian Foreign Minister, Lavrov, yesterday also made a call to Azerbaijan, declared publicly that call was open this quarter and fix the blockade. But that's a signal they're not expecting the Russian peacekeepers to open the quarter and fix the blockade. And I think there's where you see that second piece Jim asked me to address, the impact of Ukraine. It isn't simply that the peacekeepers aren't there, they are. They've not been withdrawn. It's that the pressure Russia can exert militarily on its neighbors and the influence that can be brought to bear has diminished enormously with their not good fortune in attempts to conquer Ukraine. As the world has seen the Ukrainians fight valiantly and push them back, I think all the countries of the former Soviet Union see a different Russia. And the Russia they imagine is nearby and extremely powerful may remain nearby, but not nearly as powerful. Also, the dynamic internationally in the region has changed. Russia, which in the past had bad relations with Turkey, more dependent on Turkey now for weapons, more dependent on Iran for weapons. So Russia is reluctant to jump in a big way in this region and rock the boat. And what that leaves is what your organization, Jim, is, I think, set up to do, and what International Alert was set up to do. It's created a situation where we see a danger of genocide, we see a danger of ethnic cleansing, and the need to find a way to respond. My perception is always the best approach is a diplomatic one. I don't think there's a military solution to this aside from the Russian peacekeepers on the ground doing the job they're supposed to be doing there. In the past, this would have been a key discussion within the Minsk group format. The problem with that format is there is not a lot of active diplomacy going on today between the United States and Russia because of Ukraine. And why don't I stop there? But we can see the diplomatic backdrop, the military backdrop has fed this opportunity to create a blockade, to make more pressure on Karabakh, not to create a solution, a diplomatic solution or a peace deal, but to create a solution where you're pressuring populations to move against their will.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Can we turn next to Alyssa?
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Jim first for the kind invitation to speak today at this atrocity prevention study group. It's really an honor to be here today with you, especially with such esteemed colleagues and fellow panelists. And I want to say before I start that the European Parliament just today adopted an urgent resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the blockade in Nagorno-Karabakh. I have not had a chance to take a look at that, but I wanted to point it out. And as Carrie was mentioning some of the recent work in diplomacy, we can add this to that. I've been asked to speak today as an historian about how the trauma of genocide may be affecting Armenians' views of the current conflict and possible dynamics geopolitically going forward. And I think this is a very important topic, and I'm glad that Jim raised it, because as we know, trauma shapes the lives of both individuals and collectives long past its initial causes. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with recent studies in epigenetics, which are controversial, but do seem to show, in some cases at least, that there are deeper ways in which trauma, it's not just psychological, but also somatic ways in which trauma informs life, right, going forward after a major traumatic event. Now, when we're talking about the Armenian case, the past trauma involves not just the 1915 genocide, and I want to thank Navar for a really great articulation, I think, of a framework for our conversation today and for covering the genocide a bit. So the past trauma, I think, involves not just that 1915 genocide in the Ottoman Empire, which I think needs to be pointed out that it lasted, in fact, 7 years, at least in its mass killing dimension. And as Navar was pointing out, may be continuing in ways that we generally don't talk about, but I do think needs to be on the scholarly agenda going forward, these sort of enduring genocides. And it only ended in its mass killing dimension in 1923 with this establishment of, what became permanent back then borders in the Middle East and the South Caucasus, including the establishment of the modern state of Turkey. But the Armenian trauma also involves, I think, the waves of massacre and persecution that led up to, and some historians will say culminated in, the Armenian genocide. So like most genocides, the Armenian genocide didn't come out of nowhere. And the Armenian trauma includes, and I think this is perhaps most important, the absence of justice, the lack of recognition, and the continuing threats posed by the ideologies and political forces that committed the genocide after 1923. So when we're talking about trauma, it's a very complex topic, as everything in atrocity prevention is, and it involves much more than simply the trauma, the immediate trauma of the genocidal process in its most heightened form. There is a perception in a lot of literature that post-genocide Armenians who were clustered either in the Armenian SSR, in the South Caucasus, or in the large diaspora around the world had kind of what we could call a dual consciousness about the genocide. On the one hand, diaspora Armenians, who for the most part were descendants of survivors of the 1915 genocide and who came from Western Armenia, present-day Eastern Turkey, a region that has been completely destroyed of its right, or erased, where the Armenian presence has been completely erased. These diaspora Armenians who had lost not just family members, but a whole world, advocated aggressively for the recognition of the genocide and for holding Turkey accountable, particularly after the 1960s, 1970s, when, in political terms, when the scholarship on the Armenian genocide was ascendant. On the other hand, Armenians in Armenia, particularly after the founding of the Republic of Armenia, when it declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, were preoccupied with other issues, and particularly economic and security relations with its neighbor Turkey and building a new nation state out of the Soviet Socialist Republic. And often these agendas clashed, but I think, in retrospect, we could see that they were actually not as divergent as they may appear. And I say this because anybody spending time in the Republic of Armenia will quickly learn that the stories of the genocide have been shared and continue to be shared within the population in the Republic of Armenia itself, and especially within families since World War I. I believe that over half of the Armenian SSR's population was in fact comprised of survivors. So that very new nation that was formed out of wars that were fought in the South Caucasus region after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. That very new nation was challenged by an influx of survivors from Ottoman Turkey. Under the Soviets, nationalism and ethnic-based memory, and Carrie had mentioned this, was frowned upon, and it was even persecuted. So memories were personal and familial rather than increasingly public and political as they were in the diaspora. This tension between the personal remembrance and political advocacy in the diaspora, in the post-1991 era, generally turned on the geopolitical realities of being Armenian in the South Caucasus. This region, along with what is geographically known as Western Anatolia, but as I mentioned earlier, is also Western Armenia, Eastern Turkey, and partially at least Northern Kurdistan, so it's still a contested region, has had a long-standing hostility towards Armenians since the establishment of the Ottoman Empire. And I think this is very important to point out. Armenians are indigenous to the area. So there's an irony to the fact that there's a discomfort in the region to their presence. And they date back in the area an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 years, so this is one of those parts of the world where talking about history, one's not talking in centuries, but millennia. They were always a settled people and a merchant people, simultaneously useful to their neighbors and envied by their neighbors. Very similar to other sort of middleman groups that have also been targeted for genocide. In the decades just before our Common Era, so the decades in BC, right before the Common Era, the Armenian kingdom of Tigranes the Great was in fact the most powerful empire east of Rome. And so, in inheriting Armenians, the Ottoman Empire also inherited what had been a very powerful group in the region. And Nagorno-Karabakh, the region we're specifically talking about today in the South Caucasus rather than in Anatolia, interestingly is considered to be a core region of these successive Armenian kingdoms. It has, throughout most of its history, been over 80% Armenian and dates back at least 5,000 years. So this is a region where Armenians have existed largely undisplaced, right, for thousands of years. Now, under the Ottomans, the Armenians, largely because of where they're situated, constituted an uncomfortable minority population between the Ottoman Empire and its rivals, in particular the Russians or the Russian Empire. Eventually, with the growth of Turkish nationalism, the Armenians came to be seen, in fact, as an untrustworthy minority nation and potential fifth column or internal enemy that prevented the natural expansion of pan-Turkism from Turkey through the Caucasus to Central Asia, Northeastern Russia, and parts of East Asia. So this began to happen in the 19th century when nationalism was on the ascendance in Europe, also in the Ottoman Empire, and Turkish Ottomans began to consider new futures, right, that were Turkishly ethno-nationalist in nature, and that seemed to be blockaded by this large population of Armenians. And this is the position now occupied by the Republic of Armenia. I know we didn't have time to look at a map, but if you see the map, you will see that Armenia is just situated right in between Turkey and Central Asia, Turkey and Azerbaijan. In fact, Armenia runs through two parts of Azerbaijan, the major part of Azerbaijan, which is east of Armenia, but then a small enclave that was in fact Armenian historically, but that was given to Azerbaijan like Nagorno-Karabakh by the Soviet Union. And so it splits Azerbaijan as well. This sort of southern region of Armenia splits Azerbaijan apart as well. And this is the region that President Erdogan of Turkey and President Aliyev of Azerbaijan are calling the Zangezur corridor, right? And I think my other colleagues on the panel today may talk more about that, but they are claiming that part of Armenia as well. So we're not just talking about Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, I say in parentheses, but we're also talking about land in the Republic of Armenia proper, the recognized sovereign state of Armenia that is being claimed by both Azerbaijan and Turkey in cohort with one another. So Armenia's to go back to this question of trauma, Armenia's post-1991 leaders were in the position of having to figure out how to live securely next to Turkey and Turkey's strong ally, Azerbaijan, in full awareness of the fact that neither of these countries had renounced the ideologies informing the 1915 genocide and the many massacres that came after it, including massacres in the South Caucasus, such as the 1920 massacre of up to 20,000 Armenians in the city of Shushi, which the Azerbaijanis call Shusha, which was a part of the Armenian enclave of Artsakh / Nagorno-Karabakh and is now under Azerbaijani control. These massacres then broke out again in the 1980s, when the Armenians in Artsakh, who at the time were close to 80% of the population, requested from the Soviet Union that they be able to split from Azerbaijan and become either their own entity or join Armenia. There were massacres all over Azerbaijan proper, not necessarily in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Baku, and other cities that were characterized by, in fact, types of atrocity that were committed during the 1915 genocide. So Armenia's post-1991 leaders had to figure out how to live securely next to these states where this ideology seems at least to express itself in one form or another when Armenia appears problematic to these two countries. So although post-independence leaders were not pushing for genocide recognition in the same way that the diasporan Armenians were, the trauma and the memory of genocide was ever present. So the dual consciousness that many people in the literature talk about between Armenians in the diaspora and Armenians in the South Caucasus can also be seen as a dual vulnerability that manifests itself in a dual approach to the region. On the one hand, diasporan Armenians who have found relatively safe havens in the Western world are vulnerable to loss of identity and therefore tasked with rescuing their threatened Western Armenian identity from oblivion. And some people here may know that Western Armenian culture is different from Eastern Armenian culture, and even the languages are different, and the food is different, and the historical influences are different. So in some ways, there is this overarching Armenian identity, but Western Armenians also feel tasked with salvaging what's left of that world that was completely destroyed. On the other hand, you have Armenians in the Republic of Armenia who are vulnerable to Turkey and Azerbaijan in the present, and therefore must find ways to live amidst ongoing threats to Armenian existence, threats that are sometimes more latent than others. And we are now in a period where the threats are not latent, they're quite explicit, and they're being expressed through mind-numbingly horrific atrocities committed against any Armenians that fall into the grasp of Azerbaijani soldiers. This dual consciousness and how trauma is informing Armenian views of conflict in the South Caucasus, I want to note, has been a result, and we have to see it this way, I believe, of the continued impunity of perpetrator countries and perpetrator political formations. And we could discuss what that means, right? This is not an attempt to, charge living generations with the crimes of the past, but rather to recognize that without any process of recognition, formal recognition, apology, reparation, or whatever, with any truth and reconciliation, without any truth and reconciliation process, that the genocidal language, genocidal policies, genocidal ideology is consistently in the toolbox of the countries who participated, or their former sort of identities that participated in the killing of Armenians throughout history. What is interesting about the present moment and the crisis in Artsakh, which my colleagues have discussed and will discuss in more depth, is that I think the two consciousnesses seem to be converging around the threats to Armenians in Artsakh. At the Fourth Global Forum Against the Crime of Genocide in Yerevan this past December, in fact, the president of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, gave a surprising speech in which he discussed the three patterns of genocide that are likely to occur in Artsakh and linked the threat of genocide now faced by Artsakhes to the genocide of 1915. And so there is sort of a convergence of a analysis of the threat that Armenians are now facing globally and particularly in this region. One of the reasons for this convergence, I believe, is the political manipulation of trauma by the presidents of Azerbaijan and Turkey, who appear also to be pursuing a new pan-Turkic dream of one nation, two states, as they frequently say when they meet. President Aliyev in Azerbaijan has instituted a countrywide anti-Armenian agenda for over a decade now that appears to go far beyond, however, even this simple manipulation, and has clearly stepped into the realm of planning. And for this reason, the NGO I head with my colleague, Argentine human rights lawyer Irene Massimino, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, has determined that Artsakh is facing a real threat of genocide that may actually then spill over into the Republic of Armenia proper. Now, the
Alyssa, I'm sorry, we're sort of pressed for time. Could I ask you to?
Yes, I'm on my last bit here. Absolutely. So the politics of naming aside, I'm sure there's a lot to talk about on that front of politics of naming. I want to end my comments by pointing out that victims and survivors of genocide, especially those who have experienced this crime several times in history, are very skilled at noticing red flags of genocide and identifying patterns of genocide. I've seen this again and again. From a psychological perspective, we might call this hypervigilance. And in fact, survivor communities have often been dismissed for seeing genocide everywhere, as people say. But hypervigilance is also a useful tool if one is still in threatening circumstances. So from an historical perspective, we can also see how trauma creates a useful knowledge base for threatened communities that has been forged through practical experience and that serves practical ends. So in thinking about the impact of trauma on Armenians' views of geopolitics and the current situation in Artsakh, I've been thinking about the synergy that exists between the trauma of victim groups on the one hand, and the impunity of perpetrators on the other. And so long as perpetrators have impunity, the trauma they have caused across generation acts as an important body of knowledge for threatened communities seeking safety in our world. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I went over time. Thank you.
No, thank you, Alyssa. Sirnush, we're going to pass over to you now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also thankful to the organizers for this event, and I'm honored to speak here. Of course, I'm not going to discuss the conflict itself, but to emphasize the human rights perspective. And I believe the Declaration of Independence of Nagorno-Karabakh is a collective exercise of human rights. And it was in line of international law. And here we have a very important development that none of the Security Council resolutions addressing the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic has ever questioned the lawfulness of the declaration. And here we have a contrast with other conflicts which are purely of territorial nature. Unlike the situation in Cyprus, where the Security Council deplored that the declaration of the Turkish Cypriot authorities of the purported cessation of the part of Cyprus and described it as invalid. And they also called all states not to recognize any Cypriot state other than Republic of Cyprus. And we have similar action from the Security Council in the case of Southern Rhodesia. We have in case of Republic of Srpska. And I believe that this unavailability of a call of non-recognition of Artsakh has a affirmation that the adoption of Declaration of Independence of Artsakh was in accordance of international law. But I will focus on Armenophobia because I think this long-standing and untackled practice of anti-Armenian policy by Azerbaijan lies in the roots of the conflict. And it is now well confirmed by human rights bodies, different working groups, and also international courts. Therefore, this policy should attract an adequate international response. In its most recent report on Azerbaijan, European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance clearly pointed out that political leaders, educational institutions, and media have continued using hate speech against Armenians, and the entire generation of Azerbaijanis has now grown up listening this hateful rhetoric. And the same commission deeply regretted that since the adoption of its first report in 22, this situation concerning ethnic Armenians living in Azerbaijan has not improved at all. And while international bodies continue to receive alarming information concerning racial discrimination against Armenians, the Azerbaijani authorities have not demonstrated any will to tackle the problem. On the contrary, the general attitude among national and local authorities is rather to deny that Armenians are confronted with problems. And this is very surprising because we have verified numerous national and international sources which confirm this policy. The racial discrimination is fueled by hate speech from high-ranking public officials. For example, the president of Azerbaijan actively develops statements that are translated into public consciousness. And in his speeches, often we can have references to Armenians as barbarians, vandals, fascists. We can see comparison to animals and so on. Also after the war, 44 days war, you might be aware of establishment of Trophy Park, which was dedicated to the 44 days war in Baku. And they displayed Armenian military equipment, wax figures of dead and dying Armenian soldiers. And they presented all the stuff publicly in an extremely dehumanizing and degrading way in order to incite further hostility and cynical attitude against ethnic Armenians. And the Council of Europe Commissioner of Human Rights expressed a deep concern at the inauguration of the Trophy Park, considering that such images are highly disturbing, humiliating, and such displays further intensify and strengthen long-lasting hostile sentiments and hate speech, and also multiply manifestations of intolerance. We have a similar approach from another human rights committee specialized on issues of discrimination, the CERD. In its recent concluding observations, which happened in August 2022, they again emphasized that incitement to racial hatred, propagation of racist stereotypes against Armenians, including on the internet and social media by public figures and government officials, is in place. And they specifically highlighted the lack of detailed information on investigation, prosecution, convictions, and sanctions for such acts. And they also expressed concerns about reports that school textbooks promote prejudice and racial hatred against Armenians, and that they are marginalized in a history education of the country also. We have seen that this state-sponsored hatred and impunity serve as encouragement for new crimes in the form of gross human rights violations, such as executions, torture, and so on. But what is important here, that both countries took legal cases before international courts, particularly European Court of Human Rights. And despite the fact that at a political level, you will find two-sided accusations, at a legal arena where there is an independent investigation of the facts, we have one-sided situation. In 2021, European Court delivered 5 final judgments where the court acknowledged right to life violation, torture, abduction, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and all connected to ethnicity of a victim. We cannot find a single judgment by international courts where this racial discriminatory policy is attributed to Armenia in respect of Azerbaijani people. And one of the notable cases is the case of Gurgen Markaryan. But apart from this case, 300 cases are awaiting for court determination, and majority of victims are being represented by me and also my colleagues. So why not, this case is very notable? Because here they glorified a person and ensure impunity for his grave crime against Armenian because it was ethnically motivated killing of Armenian. And the killing of Armenian was equated to an act which is subject to glorification. And the European Court clearly found that the killing of Armenian officer had an ethnic basis, but the court was particularly disturbed by the very fact that there was a special page opened on the website of a president of Azerbaijan, where the president requested the population or other public officials to welcome and glorify the heinous act of Azerbaijani officer of beheading while asleep the Azerbaijani officer. And the vast number of individuals, they thanked the president for pardoning an ordinary criminal. So with these steps, we notice that absolute impunity is being offered for hate crimes in Azerbaijan, which results in a furtherance of practice of deliberate killings of ethnic Armenians. And we have seen also aggravation in the context of armed conflict, both in 2020 and in 2022. We have many examples when executions and beheadings happened while alive, also torturing, and all these acts were accompanied by hate speech. Just one example, which though denied by Azerbaijan, was subjected to international investigation. Also Bellingcat studied the video material and confirmed its authenticity. So on a social media, a video was circulated which shows execution of 2 men, and both videos were taken in the town of Hadrut. And you can see local residents, one at the age of 73 and the second 25 years old. And in the first video, they show how Armenian men surrendered to a group of servicemen from Azerbaijani armed forces. But in the second video, you see that these 2 men with hands tied behind their backs are wrapped up in flags. So again, we see these symbols, and upon a command, they are shot multiple times. From the translation, you can see that they aim at targeting their hands, and anti-Armenian speech is accompanying. And we have very alarming verified video material also from the war 2022, when 9 Armenian prisoners of war were executed by Azerbaijani soldiers. And again, in line with their policy, Azerbaijan denies any connection with this video, mostly like challenging, disputing authenticity. But again, Bellingcat carried out a very detailed analysis of the video, geolocating it, and it identified also many pieces that support that execution of 9 Armenian prisoners of war were conducted by Azerbaijani armed forces and in the context of September war in the territory of Armenia.
Sir Anush, I'm sorry, we are running short on time. Can I ask you to finish up so that we can?
Sure. So just one important manifestation is states sponsored also policy of destruction and the Armenization of Armenian cultural heritage, which is now under the control of Azerbaijan. But we have this Caucasus Heritage Watch, which regularly monitors situation, and we have many reports which show that many cultural monuments, churches, they are under danger. They were destructed under the control of Azerbaijan. Finally, if we want to understand the potential for peaceful cohabitation with Azerbaijan, we need to see the potential of Azerbaijani state to resolve at least humanitarian issues. Those issues are not being intentionally resolved, despite the fact that we have a conventional obligation and also some statement in a trilateral agreement about releasing of all prisoners of war. At this point, 33 acknowledged prisoners are still kept in Baku. And they become also part of different criminal proceedings. They are sentenced to long-term imprisonment, but all this process is based on fabricated charges, riddled with many human rights violations. And we have also at least 80 captives which are subjected to enforced disappearance. And we have proven 40 cases when prisoners of war were subjected to extrajudicial executions, and in many cases with demonstrative methods. Concerning the Lachin corridor, you have updated just one quick update that European Court issued an order on interim measure and requested Azerbaijani side to unblock the Lachin corridor to ensure free transfer for ill people, but also those who are moving and are stuck on their way. There is no full execution of this order, and an urgent notice is sent to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. In the same line, Azerbaijan requested interim measure and also cancellation of this decision. But on 17th of January, European Court rejected the Azerbaijani request. So from legal perspective, we can see that the court stands on human rights side, and they see more human rights perspective rather than just political manipulations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Arman, we're going to turn to you.
Yes. Hello to everyone. It is a pleasure for me to join this atrocity prevention study group discussion. And dear Jim, I want also to express my thankfulness to Ms. Nevar Chalikyan for her assistance and facilitation, and for inviting, also helping us to participate and to get engaged with these discussions. And I would like to focus on the corridor that is now blocked and the developments that are surrounding it. Well, as it was mentioned in the beginning by Mr. Kerry Kawana, they very rightly mentioned on December 12th, Azerbaijani so-called eco-activists blocked this corridor. And by the way, before that, on December 3, they blocked the corridor for the first time for several hours. So December 12th was only for the second attempt. And since then, this corridor, or the only road of life, is blocked. And our foundation, Center for Law and Justice, conducted immediate research, and our studies clearly revealed that these people are not apparently independent eco-activists, but they are sponsored by the government of Azerbaijan. Some of them are current acting soldiers, members of military. Some of them are former members of military, but all of them have relations with, all of them are sponsored by the government. There are NGOs with very emotional names, titles, such as women's rights protection NGOs, elderly rights protection NGOs. But our studies, we have specialists of Azerbaijani affairs, revealed that these people are funded directly either by the government of Azerbaijan or by Heydar Aliyev Fund, which is led by the First Lady of Azerbaijan. And most of them have relations with Grey Wolves, which are this ultra-nationalistic terroristic group, which was, by the way, forbidden during the war by France, for example. So in 2 days, we will publish our second report on these eco-activists. We have detected about 200 people, leaders of these people, let's say, who with their profiles, and these studies with objective evidence prove that these people are haters of Armenians and Armenia and Artsakh, of course, promoting largely violence, by the way. And an interesting thing was that these people, on the third or fourth day, when these people blocked the corridor, they came up with the political requirements, such as installation of Azerbaijani crossing points, border crossing points at the entrance to Stepanaker, installation of customs services, of customs control, border control, and activities of law enforcement agencies. These political requirements were supported, by the way, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Azerbaijan, who supported and who confirmed this basically requirements. And we know that this was one of the official requirements of the government of Azerbaijan, which was raised during the meeting of, there were certain media publications, during the meeting with Artsakh authorities. And another thing, we talked here about Armenophobia and the hatred policy. Well, it is very evident that all of these actions are based on the policy of hatred, institutional hatred towards Armenians. And there are very interesting new narratives, by the way, the narratives which are quite new, and they developed especially after the 44-day war. For example, the first narrative is that this is quite new, that Armenians appeared in the South Caucasus at the end of 19th century. When Azerbaijanis already were here, Armenians appeared and exterminated Azerbaijani indigenous people, of course, which is apparently false information. Another new narrative is that Armenia is an artificial country created on historical ancient Azerbaijani lands. And that is why in his very recent speech, President of Azerbaijan called most part of the Republic of Armenia as Western Azerbaijan. And this is by this creating openly the grounds for aggression. And there are also his speeches where he calls Yerevan, Gegharkunik and Syunik provinces of Armenia, including Yerevan, as their strategic and political goals, which is apparently a part of this policy. There is another new narrative, which is now being very actively developed. Maybe in the past they were raising these issues, but now it is publicly developed. This is very aggressively, I would say. This is the narrative that Armenia is a mono-ethnic country, is a fascist country, and they cannot live, Azerbaijanis cannot live with Armenians. I have to say that this is also a false statement, because in Armenia there are national minorities who are so well integrated that we even do not feel that these people represent different nations. For example, Yazidis, Assyrians, Greeks, Jewish people, different other nationalities, Kurds, citizens from Iran. And I have to say that by this, they're trying to show that Azerbaijanis cannot live with Armenians. And by the way, there very recently a special survey was conducted in Azerbaijan. Results of this survey clearly show that most part of the population of Azerbaijan do not imagine living in one country with Armenians. This is the result of the hatred policy of the government of Azerbaijan for these years. And I have to say that the president of Azerbaijan also targets religion. Very often he says in his special recent speeches that in Armenia there is a Islamophobia at the government level. Of course, it is also false. And that Armenians are Islamophobic people. But this is also false because in many Arabic countries, Armenians are very well integrated, especially after the genocide when Armenians had to spread around the world. Another issue, of course, which is very important, that this, whatever now is happening to Lachin corridor, to blocking Artsakh, is very highly connected to Armenia as well, and generally to Armenianism. Because the same actions, when I was the human rights defender of Armenia, and in my current capacities, we visited many bordering communities of Armenia. We were delivering all these reports, documenting and verifying evidence. And I have to say that the similar actions also happened to Armenia. They took place also in Armenia. For example, blocking, let's take one example, blocking roads. In Armenia, in Sunik province, in 2 cities, Goris and Kapan, the roads, interstate roads, were blocked by the Azerbaijani soldiers. Armenian government had to build a so-called alternative road. Though at that time I was criticizing a lot, I was very tough on the Armenian government, claiming instead of opening alternative roads, to take all the measures to remove Azerbaijani soldiers because they were isolating our nation. And the same, literally the same now is happening to Artsakh, but more aggressively. The second point is, of course, what is happening now in Artsakh. We are basically conducting fact-finding together with Human Rights Ombudsman of Artsakh every day. Today also, there were discussions and summary of summarizing facts that we have. The situation is especially problematic because, and today I had a discussion also with the state minister of Artsakh and with the government. The situation is very critical. There are huge problems with children's rights, especially very limited, almost no access to healthcare services. In the entire Artsakh, currently, because of lack of hygiene means, there are no dental services at all. And I have to say also that there are certain types of healthcare services that are not available. Another problem is that there is no nutrition, no special food for kids, for children. Many children, about 300 children, remained without motherly care. So families are separated. And this is all information, of course, is very well known to Azerbaijani government. That currently still, for the second time, or for the third time, I'm sorry, they cut off the gas supply to Artsakh. Electricity cables are cut. People have almost there is very few access, very limited, access to electricity. There is no access, and there was no access for several days to internet cables, because internet cables were damaged, specifically in the part which are now under the control of Azerbaijan, and the Azerbaijani government was not allowing our specialists to approach these lines and to repair them. The gas supply is cut again from the same place, which is under the control of Azerbaijani either government or so-called eco-activists. The same now is for electricity cables, and the situation will be more disastrous in 7 days, in 10 days, because now Artsakh is providing electricity to the population based on its own resources. But of course, these resources are very limited. And this is just a matter of days that the situation will be more disastrous. Another problem, I'm coming to the end of my presentation. There is a very international famous principle. I myself, when I was the human rights defender, in almost platforms and conferences, there was a very beautiful slogan of the UN that no human right should be ignored and no one left aside. Unfortunately, these processes show that these sentences are, for the people of Artsakh, are just, nice expressions on the paper, because they do not work basically for these people, which is a huge problem. And unfortunately, geopolitical and economic interest here, they do play their great role. And all of us, we can experience this. Another problem is impunity. The current actions of the Azerbaijani government are highly connected to feeling of impunity. There have been no sanctions, political, economic, individual, no sanctioning, nothing, this opened up hands of the government of Azerbaijan. Moreover, Azerbaijani government is highly encouraging soldiers who may torture Armenians, who cause any harm to Armenians, even to the cynical extent that these soldiers even are with open faces while committing their war crimes. And you will never find even a single soldier who could be brought to the justice. And there is no punishment at all. And the impunity is deteriorating the situation. And of course, the proposal.
We only have.
Yes. I'm making the proposal.
10 minutes
the end. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Now I'm coming up with a proposal. There is an internationally established experience that security zones or protected zones should be established in order to protect civilian population from any ethnic cleansing policy. This is the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example. We have the position paper of the Red Cross in 1992, who said that in order to protect civilian population, there should be protected zones, because there is no possibility to remove these people to another place. They are indigenous people. The same is for Artsakh. So consequently, the only possibility is to protect these people. And in Ethiopia, Eritrea case, by the way, the UN Secretary General's special representative made a public statement, official, said that civilian population should not wait for the political relations of the countries to get regulated. It is unnecessary suffering. So that is why this international experience and I think are very important to take into account and to protect these people. An immediate goal to open the corridor, but the long-term goal to protect these people with the long-term guarantees, which is very important.